recording for us. And this morning, I am one of your presenters. I am Anita Eichler, the Family and Consumer Science Agent in Cheatham County. And Amanda Woody is going to be the second presenter today. And she is the Family and Consumer Science Agent from Pickett County. And we're excited to be with you today. Glad you set a little bit of time aside to learn today more about pressure canning. So we're going to start with a little bit of a science lesson. And we're going to talk about Clostridium botulinum, which is the toxin that creates botulism. And the reason we're starting here is because this is going to set up the importance of why we use a pressure canner. So many of our spoilage organisms are that we see on food, such as mold. We can see that it's growing. But with botulism, we don't see it and we don't smell it. So we have to just know that we are preserving our food safely in order to do that. So with the Clostridium botulinum, it is a spore-forming bacteria. In other words, when the survival environment gets rough, it creates a spore around that cell. And then when the environment is conducive to growth, it begins growing again and becomes vegetative. But in that process, it puts off a toxin that we know as Clostridium botulinum or the botulism. And that is what creates the deadly, or could be deadly, event there. So we want to make sure that we process our foods in a way that we kill off the Clostridium botulinum and are able to have a safe product for our family. And this takes time. So today we're going to talk about the processing time in our pressure canners, and that's going to be a very important part of the processing, being able to build up to that temperature, the amount of time that we hold it at that pressure, and then also the time that it takes to depressurize. All is an important part of that process. Also the temperature itself, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So let's take a look at a history lesson of a family, the Gerber family. And this is a family who all died of botulism. This was in the early 1900s, but the mother had improperly canned, processed some green beans, and then used those green beans to make a green bean salad. So it was not reheated, was not recooked. And everyone who ate of that green bean salad that day perished due to botulism. So modern canning methods have eliminated most of the threat of that botulism. From about 1996 to 2014, there were only about 210 outbreaks of foodborne botulism reported to the CDC. But out of that, about 30% were due to improper, underprocessed foods. So we still want to make sure that individuals understand. So let's look at the canning temperatures. Look, all right, let's look at the acidity of foods. So with the acidity of food, your fruits have a low pH, which means they're high in acid. And so these foods can be safely canned using a water bath canner because the spores are not easily grown within that acid and acidity of that food. However, if you look at your vegetables, your meats, your soups, your stocks, those have a very low acid level. They're more of a high pH. And so it is conducive to growing that Clostridium botulinum. And that is why we have to have a much higher temperature to be able to kill that spore. And so water bath canning is not an appropriate choice for that. So if we look at our next slide there. So with canning in a water bath canner, water boils at 212 degrees at sea level, so it's going to vary if you're at a different altitude. That is good enough for our high acid foods to be able to be processed, but our low acid foods to be able um, to be safe in our processing needs temperatures about 240 to 250 degrees, and that can only be accomplished through using a pressure canner. The pressure within that canner builds the steam that will get our temperatures up close to that 240, 250 degree level. And that's why it's so important to use that pressure canner to get that temperature up to the level that it needs to be. So you want to make sure, a couple other side notes, to use research-based recipes that are published since 1994. So if you still have grandma's old ball cooking food preservation recipes, or just an old family passed down recipe, it may not be accurate in the time and the temperature it needs to be preserved safely. So we want to make sure that we're using a research-based recipe when we are processing our foods, especially with our low acid foods. So we recommend things such as the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning, So Easy to Preserve, and the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And all of these can be located or can be found on our Extension Explorers website, and you'll have the link to that in the information that goes out to you. I think even prior to this, the reminder today had the link to that and where all those resources can be found. Okay, so next we want to talk about the processing time. Remember, we said the temperature is very important. We've got to get that up to that higher temperature, but we also have to keep it there for the right amount of time and keeping our levels there. So the process time should never be altered. That means you must give enough time for it to build pressure and then keep it at the recommended pressure along the way. And then also, it's very important that we allow our product to depressurize in a normal, natural way. So you might hear individuals say, oh, it takes so long to pressure can. And so I just speed it up by um, pulling my gauge a little, letting some of the steam out quicker, or pouring cold water on it, or ways to speed up. When we do that, we are under processing our food. We must remember to allow it to depressurize and to cool in a natural time frame there as we go along. Um, and never try to rush that. So if you're using an old canner, maybe it was grandma's pressure canner, or you found one at a yard sale along the way, it may be very heavy walled. It may have latches that clamp down and turn the lid. It may have an old dial gauge. This type of canner is going to take much longer to cool down because it's so heavy walled, but it could still be a safe canner. The only other issue with using an older pressure canner is going to be finding replacement parts for that. So, for example, your gasket, you may have a more difficult time finding a new gasket that appropriately fits that seal. The newer pressure canners, we're going to see a picture here of a newer one. You may have heard some of those scary stories of the pressure canner exploding, or many of us, when I set up at different events, that's always the comment I hear. I'm scared of a pressure canner. But pressure canners are very safe to use. And the more modern, newer pressure canners have lots of safety features that you're not going to get those scary stories anymore. For one thing, it has usually has a safety fuse. So if the pressure builds too much within that canner, it's going to release that safety fuse, and we're not going to have the big explosions. The lightweight canners, the more modern canners, do not have such a heavy wall, so they're going to cool down a little quicker, and it's going to be a little quicker process. You want to make sure when you're choosing a canner that it has the laboratory, Underwriters Laboratory uh, logo on that, so the UL that says that it's approved for safety purposes as we use. So a couple things we want to think about as we look at our new pressure canner is how to take care of it. So if you have a nicked or an old dried gasket, you want to make sure that you replace that, and you want to make sure that it's replaced um, through the manufacturer, and that you use the correct model number so that you get a proper fit of your gasket. If it isn't the proper gasket, it can not seal appropriately, so it'll be much harder to hold in that pressure and build up that temperature that we need along the way. We don't want it to leak out and destroy that, so make sure you do that. We recommend, if you use your pressure canner a lot throughout the canning season, that you replace that gasket about every 3 years along the way for normal use. Some of your older gaskets, we recommend oiling them with a little bit of vegetable oil once a year. Some of your newer gaskets are already lubricated and aren't in need of that. So just read your owner's manual along the way to make sure what they recommend for taking care of that gasket. Um, Lid safety fuses, again, are a thin metal insert or a rubber plug that's going to disengage if the pressure builds too much and relieves that. This also can be replaced at the time that you replace your gasket. It usually comes within the kit with the gasket. And the way to replace that is to push from the top of the lid, push the little rubber piece through the hole, and it'll pop out the bottom. And when you're replacing it, take the convex top and push it from the bottom of the lid up, and it'll pop into place there. So you can replace that at the same time as you replace your gasket. Let's talk a little more about care for the canner lid along with the gasket. You'll want to make sure you keep your canner lid washed and dried well. You want to make sure to run a pipe cleaner through your vent tube to make sure that it's not clogged. This can be a real issue if you end up having buildup inside that vent tube. It's going to hold more pressure inside than what you're reading on your dial gauge or on your weighted gauge. And this could cause your um, gauge not to read properly, and then it can also cause the pressure release valve to blow due to not having that cleaned out properly. You also can store your, after you've washed your canner, if you'll put a few paper towels down inside the canner, that's going to help absorb some of the moisture and absorb any odor that might be there. So when you're storing it, just store it with a few little paper towels down in there along the way. And then you can wrap your lid in paper, turn it upside down on top of your canner, and store it properly. Okay. So when we use a pressure canner, you can either have a weighted gauge or a dial gauge, and there's a little difference in them, and it's really a personal preference of what you would prefer. A weighted gauge controls the pressure by jiggling. It's letting out just little spurts of steam along the way, but it makes a rocking or a jiggling sound. Sometimes that's what makes individuals nervous, is hearing that, but that's very normal. Each pressure canner um, reacts a little different. So you'll want to read your owner's manual. Should it rock 3 or 4 times a minute, or should it rock pretty steady? And that'll let you know what to expect. One side note, if you have a weighted gauge, they are not interchangeable with other pressure canners. So make sure you keep your pressure, your weighted gauge with the proper pressure canner, and don't interchange them because they're going to fit different and react different to those. With the weighted gauge, you don't need to check for accuracy. You're going to hear that nice little rocking sound. Um, that indicates again that it's working properly, but it cannot be corrected precisely for higher altitudes. And we're going to talk about altitudes in just a minute. But with the weighted gauge, you're going to need to add the next weight. So if it calls for 5 pounds, you're going to increase that to 10. If it calls for 10, you're going to increase that to 15. And we'll talk a little more about that in a few minutes, but make sure that we're aware of that. With the dial gauge, it needs to be watched so that it maintains a constant pressure, but you will be able to read that um, on your dial gauge. You may have to tweak your temperature up and down a little bit on your oven, your stove top, to keep that maintained there. With the dial gauge, it needs to be checked for accuracy every year. And you can do that by bringing it by your local UT Extension office. We can test it here to make sure that it's reading appropriately, so that when it says that you are processing at 11 pounds, that you really are processing at that correct level. So if your dial gauge is rusted, cracked, the glass is missing, you'll want to replace that. If it reads inaccuracy over or under 2 pounds, you'll want to replace that dial gauge. If it reads within that 2 pounds, your local extension agent will explain to you how to correct your recipes to be accurate with the processing times there. Okay. One thing that we want to really um, um, be in awareness of is that a small pressure cooker or a saucepan is not accurate and a good source for canning your products. So USDA and UT Extension do not recommend using a small pressure cooker. It needs to hold at least 4 quarts along the way. Most of your tested recipes are used with a 16-quart pressure canner, but something that's larger, that's going to be able to hold at least 4 quarts and is going to have the proper weight. Remember, we talked about how important it is for that processing time that builds up to the proper temperature and then keeping it at the proper temperature, and then the appropriate time to depressurize. In a small pressure cooker, that time is going to be less than what your recipes call for because it's going to build up to pressure quicker. It's going to depressure quicker. And so you're not going to have enough time in there for that proper processing, is why that we're not going to recommend those along the way. We want to make sure that our food is always processed to the appropriate temperature. So let's talk about two of the biggest mistakes when we are using a pressure canner. One is the high altitude. So if you live in an altitude that's over 1,000 feet above sea level, your processing times are going to be different. Or if you're using the weighted scales, and so it's going to all change because when we go to the higher altitudes, our water boils at a different temperature. It takes longer. So you want to make sure that you are aware of the changes you need to make for that recipe. Most of your research-based recipes are going to share within that what alterations you need to make. And I know Amanda's going to address this a little bit more as she goes through, but just be aware that you need to alter your processing times when you are at a higher altitude. The second mistake that many of us make is that we don't exhaust our air, we don't vent. So when we have more air in our canner, it's going to affect the temperature. Our temperature is not going to be able to get up as high as it needs to go. So what we do is once we have our pressure canner on the stove and it builds up steam, it's going to allow that steam to escape through our vent port. You want to set your time once the steam starts coming out pretty consistent. You want to set your timer for 10 minutes and allow all that air, that steam to be released from um, the pressure canner before you put on your weighted gauge or close your petcock to begin building that pressure inside. That will remove the excess air and help us to build those higher temperatures that we need. And we'll talk more about that in the process as we go through today too. But those are two of our biggest mistakes that we make a lot of times. There is an app that you can get for your phone. It's called Preserve Smart. It was developed by Colorado State. It has lots of tested recipes, but it also allows you to figure out what your altitude is at your home and what changes you need to make for those recipes. It has a lot of seasonal produce and information specific to your state. And then it also covers canning, freezing, drying, so lots of food preservation options there. So we just want to share that as an additional resource for you as you're working through. So we want to talk about what happens if we under process our foods, or what if we walk into our pantry and we grab a jar of green beans and we notice that it's not sealed anymore, or that the lid is bowed on top, or we see bubbles within that product. Those are visual signs that something is not appropriate with that particular canned good. Vegetables are considered improperly canned if the food was not processed in a pressure canner, if the gauge of the canner was inaccurate, if an up to date research processing times and pressures were not used for the size jar and the packing process. If ingredients were added that were not in the approved recipe, and we didn't really talk about that, and we will address that in a little while, but if a recipe calls for a certain amount of a food at a certain size, that is all in that tested amount of time with the weight of the product versus the processing time. So we don't want to change recipes. That changes processing times. Um, Also, if the processing times or the pressure were not correct or the altitude was not considered, those are all times that we consider that food improperly canned. All right. If we come up to a product and we pick it up and we think, we're not sure about this product, or it looks a little questionable, there are some ways to discard that safely. Do not taste or use canned vegetables that show any signs of spoilage. If there is anything that is giving you a red flag about that product, don't taste it. You're going to put it in a heavy plastic bag, like a garbage bag, wrap it up, and then put it into your normal trash. You want to make sure that you discard the questionable food so that a human nor a pet will eat that food, because it can be very deadly to either one. All spoiled canned foods, again, should be discarded where there's no humans. If the product is already opened or it's not sealed, you want to make sure that you um, properly dispose of it first by laying it in a large stock pot. Put your jars on the side, bring them to a heavy boil for about 30 minutes, and then you can let them cool and discard of them appropriately at that time. You also want to be aware of any surfaces that might have come in contact with that food that you opened. So again, you want to wear rubber gloves, because the botulism can be deadly if it's ingested, but also it can be deadly if it is absorbed through your skin. So you want to make sure that you have on rubber gloves. Make a Clorox substance of 1 part Clorox to 5 parts water. Spray all your surfaces down. Let it set for 30 minutes. Wipe it with paper towels. Put your paper towels in a plastic bag and then into the garbage. Spray down your surface a second time. Let it set again. And then at this time, you can clean with your regular cleaning products. But that will make sure, think about your faucet, your handles, your sink, countertops, anything that you feel has come in contact with that tainted food. You'll want to make sure to discard appropriately along the way. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda, and she's going to step you through the process, the proper process of actually canning your green beans. Amanda?
Thank you, Anita. Now we are going to talk about how to actually pressure can those green beans. So we want to start by selecting and preparing the green beans. About 14 pounds are needed per can or load if you're canning quarts, and that'll make 7 quarts, and then about 9 pounds for 9 pints. We want to make sure that we're selecting filled but tender, crisp pods, and then removing and discarding any diseased or rusty pods. We always want to start with the best quality vegetables that we can. Wash the beans, trim the ends, and then we can leave them whole or cut them or snap them into 1-inch pieces. Next, we're going to prepare the jars and lids. We want to start by checking the jars. Look for nicks, cracks, rough edges, and discard those jars. Those little defects will cause your jars not to seal and the food could spoil. The jars need to be washed in soapy water, rinsed, and then kept hot. You can keep them hot in water or in a dishwasher. They need to be kept hot in order to prevent breakage when they're filled with hot foods. We also need to use a new flat lid each time. Don't reuse these lids from year to year and then follow the manufacturer's instructions for preparing the lids. Your ring bands can be reused from year to year if they're in good condition. So check these and make sure that they're free of rust, dents, and make sure that the shape is still what it should be. Now we're going to fill the jars. Food into jars, and depending upon the food, you're going to use either a raw pack or a hot pack. In the USDA processing instructions for vegetables, sometimes there's instructions for both, and sometimes there's just instructions for the hot pack. And either one is appropriate for green beans. So for a raw pack, you're going to take your unheated green beans. You're going to So raw pack is the practice of filling the jars tightly with freshly prepared but unheated food and then covering with hot liquid. So one advantage of raw packing is time saved on heating the food. However, some foods, especially fruit, will float in the jars because they have a lot of air in them. The air trapped in and around the food may cause discoloration within 2 to 3 months of storage. So for the raw pack, you put your green beans in your jar and then cover with hot liquid and pack the jars tightly. Now, hot packing is the practice of heating freshly prepared food to boiling and then simmering it for 2 to 5 minutes and then promptly filling the jars with the boiled food. Um, when the food has been hot packed or raw packed, then the water added will also be heated before adding it to the jars. And this helps to remove the air from the food tissues, shrinks food, helps keep the food from floating, and increases the vacuum in the sealed jars and improves shelf life. The pre-shrinking food permits filling more food into the jar. An advantage of hot packed food is that you can get more food in your jar compared to raw packed, and color and flavor may be better over time with a hot packed versus the raw packed. You won't notice any difference immediately, but over time is where you'll notice that difference. Next, we're going to prepare the jars for the process. We're going to use 1-inch headspace. And headspace is the amount of unfilled space above the food in a jar and below the lid. It's typically 1 inch for foods that are processed in a pressure canner, and this space is needed for the expansion process and for forming a vacuum in cooled jars. If you don't leave enough headspace, then the food will expand and interfere with the seal. If there's too much headspace, then the processing time may not be long enough to drive all of the air out. Air can become trapped in the jars after they're filled with food and liquid. When the food is processed, this can result in too much headspace. So use a rubber or plastic spatula or a debubbling tool that's sold by several different companies to remove the air. Run the spatula or the tool around the edge of the jar and then press towards the center to remove that air. You can adjust your headspace now if needed. And these newer debubbling tools are really handy to have because you can get the air out, and then most of the time they include a measuring guide on one side to help you measure your headspace accurately. Next, you're going to wipe the rims. So before you apply the lids, wipe the rims of the jars with a damp cloth to remove any liquid or food that might interfere with the seal, and then apply the lids to your jars. Use your fingertips to tighten the lids rather than your hand so you avoid over tightening. And if they're too tight, then the air cannot escape the jars during the processing and they may buckle and the seals might fail. To use your pressure canner, you need 2 to 3 inches of hot water, not boiling water, just hot water in the canner. Sometimes your process may call for more water, so make sure you're following your instructions. But for green beans, it's 2 to 3 inches of water. You're going to place your jars on a rack using a jar lifter. Always keep your jar upright, never tilt them, and then fasten your lid securely. Turn the temperature up to high, but don't place the weight or the counterweight on the vent pipe, and continue heating until you see a steady stream of steam coming from the pipe. It should not be sputtering, but it should be pretty consistent steam, and then set your timer for 10 minutes. The process gets different depending upon if you're using a weighted gauge or a dial gauge. So for the weighted gauge, let the canner heat quickly until the steam begins to escape from the gauge or begins moving, and then adjust the heat down slightly until it jiggles or rocks according to the manufacturer's directions. So make sure you're reading that manufacturer's instructions to know what to look for in your weighted gauge. Now for the dial gauge canner, you're going to let the pressure rise quickly to 8 pounds and then adjust the temperature down slightly to let it continue to rise to the recommended pressure. Regulate the heat under the canner to maintain a steady pressure. And one type of weighted gauge will jiggle a certain number of times per minute, while another rocks throughout the process. So check your manufacturer's instructions. If you have a dial gauge, watch your dial gauge as you're processing to make sure that that pressure stays steady throughout your process. If at any time it goes below the recommended amount, then you need to bring the canner back up to pressure and begin the timing process over from the beginning using the total process time. And this is really important for food safety. This chart shows how long to process your jars. So processing time in a dial gauge canner, you can see the hot and raw pack, pints or quarts, process time, and then the altitude. So if you're doing quarts of green beans and your altitude is under 2,000 feet, then you're going to process that for 11 minutes. 25 minutes at 11 pounds. And then in your weighted gauge, you can see on the chart as well. Now, knowing your altitude is really important. So you can check your altitude at this website, whatismyelevation.com. If you have your location set on your computer, it'll tell you your elevation, your altitude automatically. And if you don't, you can enter your address to check your altitude. And it's really important to know so that you know how long or what canner pressure you need to be using for your green beans. Now, when your process is complete and the time is over, you're going to turn off the heat, remove the canner from the burner if possible, and let the canner depressurize. So when you're moving it, you want to lift the canner to move it. You don't want to slide it. And it's okay to leave the canner in place on the burner after you've turned off the burner. It's better to do that and let the jars sit rather than trying to move it and causing the jars to tip over if the canner is too heavy. Allow that time to cool and depressurize. Do not force it to cool. The canner can warp. You could lose liquid inside your jars and the seals may not work properly. So give it that time to cool and depressurize. And then standard size heavy walled canners require about 30 minutes with when they're with pints and 45 with quarts. And then newer thin walled canners cool more rapidly and are equipped with vent locks. And these canners are depressurized when their vent lock piston drops to a normal position. After it's depressurized, remove the weight from the vent port and then wait 10 minutes, fasten the lid and remove it carefully. Make sure to lift it away from you as well. Now you're going to remove the jars from the canner. Use a jar lifter and place them on a towel or on a cooling rack, leaving at least an inch between the jars so that they can cool. Be sure to keep the jars upright, don't tilt them, and then let them sit there let them sit there to cool at room temperature for 12 to 24 hours. After that 12 to 24 hours is up, you're going to get your green beans ready for storage. First, check the seal by pushing down on the lids to see if they spring back. If they do spring back, then they're not sealed. If this happens, you can reprocess the food within 24 hours. Just use a new lid and follow the same steps as earlier. If you had a jar that didn't seal, you can also freeze the jar. You can freeze the food in that jar. And if only one jar is unsealed, it might be better to just store that in the fridge and use it within a day or two as well. So once they're sealed, you want to remove the rings, and this prevents them from rusting during storage. It also makes it easier for you to check your jars for spoilage. Rinse the jars to remove any food residue, and then label the jars. So write green beans on your jars, also write your date. And if you processed more than one batch, it's a good idea to give your batches a lot number or a batch number so that you can easily check your jars while they're in storage, know which jars were canned or processed at the same time. And then you want to store them in a clean, cool, dry place. The heat will cause canned food to lose quality in a few weeks, and otherwise, they should last for 12 months. A good rule of thumb when you're preserving your food at home is to only can what you can eat within a year. And since this is about green beans, we can't forget to mention freezing green beans. So when you're freezing green beans, select young, tender pods when the seed is first formed, wash in cold water, snip the ends, and cut into 2 to 4 inch lengths. Water blanch them for 3 minutes, cool promptly, and then drain them. Package, leaving a half an inch headspace, seal them and freeze them. Don't forget to label them so you know what they are in the freezer. Here are some resources that you may find helpful. These resources are also on the website, the Extension Explorers website that we have, so you'll be able to um, view all of those. But we get a lot of our information as National Center for Home Food Preservation, the UT Extension canning publications, and then freezing publications. I
Okay, at
think
this
we
point, oh, sorry, Amanda.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was just going to say, I think that we are ready to stop our recording.